My name is Bill Ayers. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I'm a teacher, an activist, and an organizer. You know, the book that I wrote, When Freedom is the Question, Abolition is the Answer, and then the subtitle is Reflections on Collective Liberation. And every one of the terms in the title is complex and layered. So what is abolition? Abolition is not something so simple. Even finding the correct historical analog doesn't solve the problem. Some people think of abolition. I mean, the classic American example is the abolition of slavery. But the abolition of slavery was not only a process, but it was a complex set of processes that went one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, one step back. And frankly, that process is still going on. But the concept of abolition and the radical abolitionists of the 80s was that you have a deep moral, ethical wrong, and that wrong is slavery. And we must think about how we're going to deal with that. And the debate inside the United States was, some people wanted to reform slavery. Some people wanted to stop the Atlantic slave trade. But the radical abolitionists said, slavery is wrong. We must abolish it. But abolition wasn't so simple because the deeper meaning of abolition is world building. So what kind of a world can we build where slavery is no longer a necessity or a possibility? How can we do away with this evil once and for all? And frankly, the abolitionists who, in many ways were the driving force for the Civil War, which did liberate the slaves. But then the real work also began then, or another phase of the real work, which was how do we build the world in which slavery is unnecessary, in which it's not tied into our economic life, in which we can live in a multiracial democracy? How do we do that? And for 8 years, radical Reconstruction in the South after the Civil War of the 1860s, after that Civil War, the radical Reconstruction took place and it didn't win. It was set back by a reaction, by a counter-revolution, and that included the Ku Klux Klan, lynching, and so on. Now, I'm sorry that my references are mostly American history, but that's kind of what I've lived and what I understand. So you have to think about abolition as partly destroying the old, but equally important, or perhaps more important, building the new. It's world building. That's what abolition means at its core. After the Civil War in the United States, and again, if I get too American-centric, you can stop me and push me, but after the American Civil War, there was a great moment called Reconstruction, in which this was when public schools were founded in the United States. This is when voting rights became an issue. This is when the amendments to the Constitution were passed that guaranteed people due process of law, that guaranteed them birthright citizenship, incidentally, all of which is under attack in the United States today, interestingly, 150, 170 years later. But I think that what's important is that the concept of world building is a concept of trying to not only do away with the wrong, something right. And I can give you another example, a more current example from my own life. 20 years ago, the state of Illinois in the United States, which is where I live in Chicago, the state of Illinois abolished the death penalty. We in many ways led the nation for a period of time in saying the death penalty is evil, the death penalty is wrong, it's racially charged. We have to abolish the death penalty. And just like the abolition of slavery, the energy to abolish the death penalty came from death row itself. In other words, it was inmates who were held in death row, who were scheduled for execution, that made a commitment to ending this evil, cruel, unjust, and racist policy. And they began to organize. And that led to a group called the Death Row 10, many of whom were wrongfully convicted. That led to the creation of a group called the Mothers of the Death Row 10. And from there, journalists, lawyers, activists, community members got involved in a giant movement to get rid of the death penalty. And 20 years ago, last year, we did get rid of the death penalty. And that was a great victory for humanity, I think. And it became an example everywhere. But there was another problem, which was we still have death by incarceration. We still have, that's what the men on death row call it, death by incarceration, meaning that we don't have, we no longer have the law that puts you in an electric chair or fills your veins with poison, but we do have sentences that are 600 years, 200 years, life without possibility of parole. That's death by incarceration. So on the one hand, we got rid of a demonstrably evil system. On the other hand, there's more work to do. And so that's kind of the nature of abolition, is you name an obstacle to humanity, you fight like hell against that obstacle, but then you have to realize you have to build up systems that make that evil go away for good, and also create the conditions for a more prosperous, a more vital society. And that's still the work I do. Well, all of my writing is personal, and I've written several books, and I've been writing for a long, long time. I was a professor. I'm still a professor, but I was a professor at the University of Illinois for 30 years. I wrote several books about education, about youth in trouble with the law, and so on. But this book is a series of connected essays, and the theme of the essays is always freedom, it's always abolition, and it's always collective liberation. So that's what connects the essays. But you ask which one is most personal. As I say, all of my writing is personal. But I would say chapter 2, I can give you the titles. Let me see. Yeah, here we are. Chapter 2 is called A World That Could Be, But Is Not Yet. And that's the chapter where I begin with my arrest, 1968, at a demonstration against the war in Vietnam and against white supremacy for civil rights. That arrest was part of a massive demonstrations against war and against racism. And in that moment, I tell the story of being arrested in downtown Chicago in a mass arrest, and realizing that as we were being carted off to prison, off to jail really, that the feeling that we had inside that police van was one of ecstasy. So even though we had been beaten up, even though we were bleeding, even though we were on our way to jail, we felt a sense of liberation, a sense of freedom. And why did we feel it? This is a paradox. The paradox is we felt it because we threw ourselves against the barricade of war and injustice. And because we threw ourselves against that barricade, we experienced freedom. And I give other examples, but that's a very personal revelation at the age of 20, that freedom can be found in the most unlikely places. But I would say also, in many ways, chapter 4, which is called No Gods, No Masters, begins with an essay when I was in Europe many years ago, meeting a man named Manolis Glessos, who was famous throughout Europe for taking the Nazi flag off the Acropolis during the German occupation of Greece. And Manolis became a hero as a teenager, spent many years in prison, but at the age of 90 was still vital, vibrant, fighting the good fight and fighting for freedom. And so spending a day with Manolis, I described our conversation, and that also was very personal. But what it gets into then is the question of liberation, the question of socialism, question of anarchism. And I quote the great anarchist socialist philosopher Bakunin, who says, basically, socialism without freedom is control and autocracy, but freedom without socialism is predation, exploitation, and cruelty. And that you can just open your eyes and see that that's true. If you put forward freedom without any sense of community, if you forward the toxic notion that individual freedom is all there is to the concept of freedom, then you come to grips with the fact that freedom for the conqueror is always cruelty and murder for the conquered. And that dynamic is something that I play with a lot. But that's a very urgent and personal matter to me, because we can look in the 20th and the 21st century and see examples of socialism without freedom, which is terrible. But if we just open our eyes and look at what freedom looks like without community, without any sense of collective well-being, that leads to, environmental destruction. It leads to cruelty. It leads to war. and it leads to super exploitation. So that's a very personal one. And I guess the last chapter I would mention is chapter 8, Abolition is the Answer. And in that chapter, I talk a lot about my own children and raising children and becoming a teacher. And, I think that I actually talk a lot about uh, the many years that I was a teacher from 1965 on, but also the 20 years of raising my own kids. And one of the things I think about a lot is that kids don't need a lot of complicated theorizing to understand some of these basic concepts. So I tell the story of a friend who's reading to her 5-year-old a story about a group of American indigenous women blocking an oil pipeline from Canada through their territory. And the little 5-year-old boy is loving the story. And then he says, I want to join the grandmothers in their protest. And his mother says, what would your signs say? And he looks at her and says, no pipelines. It's not complicated. He doesn't say, build your pipeline in another place. In other words, to him, if the wrong is a pipeline, the answer is abolition. So, again, I had a lot of fun writing these essays, these connected essays, but I also, all of it is deeply felt and very personal and something I've been at for now 80 years. So, well, I gave a bit of an example a minute ago, but I can tell you more about it. And that is that sometimes when we think of freedom, either of a one-dimensional concept of freedom, I'm free to walk outdoors and breathe the air. I'm free to ride my bicycle wherever I want to. So there's a kind of one-dimensionality to that. But the experience of freedom is much more than that. And it's not only is it not just individual, there always has to be a social aspect. And finding that social collective aspect is part of the work of organizers, activists, ordinary citizens, and residents. That is, what is it about freedom that is about all of us? And so the paradox for me is that we often experience freedom most clearly when we find ourselves butting our heads against unfreedom. And so if you want a working definition of freedom, but as I say, freedom is dynamic, it's a process, it's ongoing. But if you want a working definition, it has to do with opposing unfreedom. You feel freest when you can identify unfreedom and move against it. Many, many examples in our life experience. There was no such thing as the gay liberation movement until there was the gay liberation movement. And gay people, queer people experienced oppression individually. They found themselves coming up against, obstacles to their humanity, obstacles to their full expression of themselves. But it was when they identified themselves in community and moved as a community against the things that oppress them as a community. That's when they experienced freedom most fully. And that's true across the board. One of the most exciting examples for me, because it was a complete surprise, was many years ago, decades ago now. There have always been throughout history and in every society, people who are disabled, who, have certain needs around ability to walk or see or hear or any number of disabilities. But there was no such thing as a disability movement until there was. And it came about in the kind of air of the 1960s and 70s, where there was a great spirit of freedom loose on the land, and a group of young people who happened to go to a camp in upstate New York found themselves and said to themselves, well, you're experiencing this problem and I'm experiencing this problem. What could we do about it together? And it's that important question, important statement. What can we do about it together? And what they began to do is to say they found themselves a few years later as students at the University of California. And they said to themselves things like, I can't get my wheelchair up this sidewalk to class. Let's, in the middle of the night, get some cement, some concrete, and we'll lay a curb cut. We'll make a curb cut so that my wheelchair can go up. And this was civil disobedience. It was illegal. And these disabled people, these disabled activists, built curb cuts in Berkeley, California. And this led to a movement that is still going strong. It led to legislation. It led to civil disobedience. It led to activism. But what it did was it created a public where there was no public before. That is, one person might have been disabled in one way, one in another, but they didn't think of themselves as a community until they began to work together. And at that moment, they saw themselves as free, even though they were still suffering the same oppression because of a society built on able-bodiedness. But that society began to change, and it changed because of the activism and the paradox of people who were oppressed, naming their oppression and acting against it. I mean, I was very fortunate to come of age when the American Civil Rights Movement, the latest iteration of the Black Freedom Movement, was at a high point in the 90s and 60s. And it released an incredible energy toward freedom. And it kind of was in the air we were breathing, this idea that people who had been kept down, who suffered a legacy of oppression and exploitation, were now rising up, renaming themselves, rethinking their futures. And that spirit was catchable, and I caught it. And the spirit of freedom was loose on the land in the United States in the 60s and 70s and 1950s. And I was very fortunate to be a part of that. So I mean, what we were struggling for, what the movement was struggling for in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is still what we're struggling for, which is recognition of the full humanity of everyone, a recognition that we're all better off when we're all better off, a recognition that we are each other's magnitude and bond, and that we need to move together to create a society where everyone can flourish, where everyone has everything they need to live a life of dignity. And that struggle continues. And in many ways, the struggle has intensified in this country, and I think worldwide, in the last several years. And I think it's motivating me to this day. What I talk about in one of the chapters is truth, reparations, and reconciliation. So we think of things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which is an interesting and important model. But you can't reconcile an injustice unless you repair the injustice. There are very simple examples. For example, if I'm driving a car and somebody goes through a red light and hits me, it's one thing to tell the truth about it. This person went through a red light. I was hurt by that person going through a red light. And then we want to reconcile. Well, we can't reconcile until we repair the damage. And somebody's responsible to repair the damage. And if you take that tiny example and you think it in societal terms, that's what I'm talking about. I'm saying you must tell the truth. Now we're living through a period in this country, in the United States, where the truth is become negotiable and obscure. And that's a very dangerous thing, because if you don't tell the truth, you can't repair the damage. If you can't repair the damage, you can't reconcile. And all it does is create more cycles of resistance, exploitation, violence, and so on. So we're in a very difficult moment here. But what I'm arguing in that essay is that you can't come to terms with the world if you don't recognize the damage that's been done and tell the truth about it. Then you have to work to repair it. So reparations is very high on my agenda of what we need to think about if we're going to repair the harm that's been done to people, to real people in real time in society. Uh, Well, I'm a lifelong educator. I started teaching when I was 20 years old, and I was fortunate to be again, part of the freedom movement. And I learned something very important when I was a 20-year-old teacher. And that is that education, we can't really move toward freedom. We can't move towards liberation if we're not educated. That is, education is always rests on the twin pillars of enlightenment and liberation. Education is about freedom. And to me, I was lucky, as I say, because I got involved in what were called freedom schools. And these were schools that were that their genesis was in Mississippi during the freedom movement, the Black freedom movement. And, some of the organizers looked around and said, the Black people of Mississippi have been denied many things: fully trained teachers, decent facilities, forward-looking curriculum. But the fundamental injury is that they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how they might be otherwise. Now, think about that. What they're saying in that simple statement is that education is always about asking yourself, where am I? Who am I? How did I get here? Where do I want to go? And that was a revolutionary question in 50s Mississippi, 60s Mississippi. And it led to a resurgence of the Black freedom movement, but it also led to some very, very serious kind of reaction to that freedom movement. That is, the Ku Klux Klan was revitalized and fighting hard because they didn't want people to ask that fundamental question: how did I get here? What do I want? Where am I going? What are the circumstances of my life that I would like to change? That's why education is so important. And for me, the fundamental aspect of my teaching has always been to communicate a strong message to my students, whether they be preschoolers or graduate students. The message is always, you have a right to be here. You need no one's permission to interrogate the world. You have every right to name yourself and to work to improve the world on your behalf. And all of us have that right. And so my teaching is always based on that notion of kind of, instead of thinking of teaching as, conveying information, my teaching is always about recognizing the fullness of the human beings who come into my classroom and then encouraging them to unlock the wisdom that's already there. In other words, it's not so much conveyance of information as it is asking the right questions, moving collectively to solve problems. And that's what I think. That's why I think education is linked to freedom. In many ways, education, democracy, and freedom go together hand in glove. They are inseparable. I mean, the truth is that freedom, organizing for freedom, can take place in any venue, any place. And my argument to citizens, residents, activists, organizers is that there's no perfect or right place to act or to be. There is no, people say, what's the best thing I can do? There is no best thing. You have to know where you're situated, and you need to organize for freedom wherever you are. So I'm not against people organizing in the electoral arena, but I don't think that people should foreground the electoral arena as if that's the only place people can make a difference or, have a say in things. I think that there's room to organize in a classroom, in a church, in a mosque, in a synagogue, in a community. And I think that those are all places where wherever people gather, those are places where people can name the political moment, name the obstacles to their full humanity, name the obstacles to the humanity of their neighbors and friends, and then move collectively to solve those problems, to overcome those obstacles, to meet those challenges. Well, I think that we touched on this a minute ago, but I think that Bakunin said it perfectly. Socialism without freedom is control and cruelty. And what that means, and we have plenty of examples from the 20th and first century, where an economy or a society is organized as a collective, but there's no freedom for people to act or express themselves, and that becomes control. But the other side is equally true. Without socialism, is predation and exploitation and war and violence. And I think the dialectic is important to keep in mind because, Let me Well, that's what we're wrestling with. It seems to me that, the Black freedom movement has examples. I mean, the Black freedom movement was fighting for your right to drink at a water fountain, or for your right to stay in a hotel, or for your right to vote. It was fighting for that, but it was also fighting for the community's rights to be all those things and to do all those things. And so I think holding on to the dialectic, keeping it in mind, is always an important aspect of this. So I teach in prison in Illinois. I now have been retired from the University of Illinois for 15 years, and I teach adjunct in a lot of different universities. But the most exciting teaching I do is inside prison. And in the prison movement, we have talked for a long time in the United States about what's sometimes called the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration. And I am working and have been working as part of a movement that wants to decarcerate our society. That is, we don't want the default position to be make a mistake, commit a crime, be punished, go to the cage, and stay there forever. We want to fight against that kind of a cruel system. And part of that is saying we need to work at the front end to solve the conditions of crime. And I'll give you a quick example. So I told you we abolished the death penalty. We also fought hard to get a medieval dungeon called Stateville Prison closed. And we won. Stateville Prison was closed last year. It was a great victory for the prison abolition movement. And yet our governor, a fairly progressive guy, fairly progressive on criminal legal issues, he decided in his budget to put in an item, $900 million to build a new prison. And those of us who are involved in this decarceration work immediately rose up and said, wait, $900 million for a prison when you could spend $900 on housing, healthcare, education, the arts, parks, and so on. That would mean you wouldn't need that prison at the other end. And those are the kinds of struggles that we need to be involved in. How we create a movement that represents those ideas is a mystery, but it's a mystery we are working on solving. And the reason I say it's a mystery is every social movement is a mystery. That is to say, the day before any social movement, whether it's Rosa Parks in the south of the United States or Gandhi in India, the day before all the talking heads were saying it's impossible, it'll never happen. The day after a revolution, everyone says, oh, that was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable, but it wasn't impossible either. And so my thinking is always to expand our radical imaginations, to give ourselves space to breathe and think, but also to be real, to be down on the ground. So my daughter-in-law, who I co-taught with at Stateville Prison, she's a poet and a novelist, she did a very clever thing. She went into the high schools in Chicago and she taught kids to write a haiku, the simple method of the simple structure of a haiku. And then she gave the kids this prompt: write a haiku about what you would do to make Illinois a flourishing and safe state, and make it in a haiku. What would you do if you had $900 million and you could make Illinois a flourishing and safe state? And not one kid came up with build a prison. They came up with the arts, the parks, the youth programs, employment, housing. If you have, which we have in the United States, millions of people who are unhoused, if you have millions of people who are illiterate, if you have millions of people who have no access to health care or mental health care, you have no community mental health clinics, those are the things that we could work on now to make the back end of prisons obsolete. And that's kind of what I struggle with. Well, I think when people think, let me say it this way. I am a huge believer in releasing our imaginations. And it's very hard to think of a world that you've never seen. It's hard because we drag into the possibility of a new world all the kind of baggage from the old. But I want us to release our radical imaginations and think about what could be, what is possible. And so One of the things that I think is misconception about the notion of abolition is that it's somehow nihilistic. And it's just the opposite. Abolition isn't nihilistic. Abolition is, as I said earlier, is about world building. And you need to ask the question, what kind of a world would we need to build in order to do away with mass incarceration? Or what kind of a world? Here's a simple question that I often ask students and others. What would policing look like in a free and democratic society? What would the police look like? And it's a complicated question because people will often say, well, we live in a free society and the police look like this. In the city of Chicago, a third of our budget goes to the police. A third. Now, what would happen if a third of our budget went to education and a third of our budget went to housing and health? What then would happen? And it's those kinds of things that I hope my book and my organizing provoke. I think I use poetry a lot in my teaching. Use literature a lot. Even if I'm teaching education or ethics, I always go to film and poetry and music and art. And the reason I do is because art opens up our imaginations. And I don't feel like I'm, you know, a creator of art particularly, but I think that each of us has the capacity to think of our own lives as a project of art. So, you know, in each of our lives, there's a time when everything seems possible. And in each of our lives, there will come a time when nothing is possible anymore. But in between, we create. And so I am drawn to the arts because they push me to think beyond what is into what is possible. So for me, one of the great Chicago artist poets who was the poet laureate of Illinois several times is a woman named Gwendolyn Brooks. And I urge people to look up and read the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks. But she has a marvelous poem that is dedicated to a statue that Picasso donated to Chicago decades ago. And it's called Dedication to the Picasso. And she begins the poem by asking a question. Does man love art? And her answer, man visits art, but cringes. Art hurts. Art urges voyages. And that's how I think of art. That sums up how I think of art. That it's not just decorations. It's not, clouds in the sky. Art is something that provokes you. It rips you open. It asks you to think about things in a different way. And it does it in such a powerful way that you find yourself rethinking everything when you confront a piece of art and give yourself to it, whether it's Guernica by Picasso or the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks. It hurts and it urges voyages and it makes you think and rethink. That's why I use it. That's why I love it. Well, I've been accused of being utopian my whole life. So you're asking the right question. I have been called a romantic, an idealist, and a utopian. And it's true. I'm not a romantic in that I'm naive, and I'm not an idealist in that I'm naive. But I do have ideals that I want to work toward. I do ask my students, and I've asked my students for years, a question that was asked of me when I was 19 years old. And the question is, how will you live your life in a way that it doesn't make a mockery of your values? That question is so powerful and so dynamic. And it's a question you can revisit every year, every day, because it resonates with new meanings the more you live. But so for me, being an idealist is not a curse. It's not a bad thing. But it's interesting. I had dinner many years ago with the Uruguayan writer and revolutionary Eduardo Galeano. And we were joking about the fact that we have both been accused of being idealists. We've both been accused, because of our writing, because of our speaking, because of our teaching, of being utopians. And Galeano said, yes, somebody asked me, what good is utopia? And my response was, well, you have a point. If I walk 2 steps towards utopia, utopia walks 2 steps away. If I walk 10 steps towards utopia, utopia walks 10 steps away. So what good is utopia? And Galeano's answer, it's good for walking. And I take that seriously. I think that if you don't have an ideal, if you don't have a vision of what you're walking toward, if you don't have a North Star, you will be tangled and confused in your everyday work. It's good to have a North Star, not a dogma, not something that's fixed, but something that's possible that you're moving toward. So yes, I am a utopian in that sense. And I think it's important that all of us work collectively to develop a vision of what we think the world could be and should be, but is not yet, and then work toward that. The other thing I'll say about utopia is that there are many, many examples of utopia in my own life. And I talked earlier, and you read the part about being in a police wagon and feeling ecstasy because we had opposed the evil of war and the evil of racism. And in that little police wagon, in that jail cell, was a form of utopia. And similarly, during Occupy Wall Street, which was a movement in the United States that happened a decade or so ago, in the encampments on the campuses, I saw utopia, not perfection. And that's an important distinction. It's not perfection. It's the idea that human beings working together can develop qualities like compassion, empathy, self-care, mutual aid, helping one another, recognizing our commonality and working for the common good. These are things that we can do, that humanity has done through history. But the confusion is people think when you say utopia, you're talking about heaven or perfection. No, human beings are not perfect and they're not heavenly. They are rather idiosyncratic, weird, and all that. But nonetheless, we can find common ground. We can work toward mutual aid and caring for one another. Those are the things that we want. And frankly, when I, again, back to this question of capitalism, now that I'm an old person, I'm 80 years old, and it amazes me to see the all-encompassing nature of capitalism and the fact that they can take elder care, taking care of the old people, and turn it into a market and extract profit from it is just staggering to me, because that's an example of how capitalism gets into every aspect of your life and kind of takes control. You know, I think the pandemic was revelatory in so many ways. Again, for me, at least, around this question of freedom, because you realize during an emergency like the pandemic or an emergency like the destruction of the environment, you realize that even though I'm experiencing life as an individual and I have a life that I want to live and should live, and each of us does, but we also recognize suddenly in the emergency of a pandemic that we are all in this together. So there are 9 million people breathing the common air, inhaling and exhaling. And even though my inhaling and exhaling is particular to me, it's also I'm breathing in and out with 9 billion others. And if I want to add to that lions and lemurs and birds and, insects, then we're all in this together. And I think that's the lesson to me of things like emergencies like the pandemic, or like the rising oceans, or like the wildfires and the disappearance of species, is this sense that let's take this as a moment to understand that we are each other's magnitude, we are each other's bond, we are each other's necessary partners in this adventure. And without that, we're going nowhere. Well, how they can do it, I'm not certain. What I am certain of is that policymakers and political leaders and the political class in general never does anything without mobilization of people on the ground. That is to say, nothing that you can point to, and you pointed to certain European, the social safety net and so on, the welfare state, none of that came about because of the good intentions of leaders, because of uh, movements from below. It always comes about because of fire from below. In the United States, a great example is Abraham Lincoln, who was the president during the Civil War and is often credited with freeing the slaves. But if you read Lincoln's first inaugural address, he literally says to the slave owners, I have no interest in interrupting your business. You do what you do. I just want to keep the Union, what he said. And in his second inaugural address, 4 years later, that's the address everybody learns in school, because that's the one where he says, for every drop of blood brought on by the lash, we will answer it with a drop of blood brought on by the sword, and so on. And he talks about reparations. So what happened in those 4 years? Well, self-liberating slaves changed the whole dynamic of what was going on. A civil war occurred. And now Lincoln sounded like Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, formerly enslaved person. So the point is that is a result of mass movements. It's the result of mass consciousness. And political leaders will do what they do when required to do it. And all the social reforms that we've seen in history are the result of fire from below. And even though it's important to walk toward fundamental change on two legs, one being the mobilization of masses of people, the other being real politics, my interest is in the first. I'm interested in organizing, mobilizing, activism. And I also think it's important to play a role in real politics, meaning policy. But I think without the former, you're never going to get to the latter.